So yeah, we looked at, we did, some of you will be aware, hopefully a lot of you are aware, that we did a piece of work around option 2 last year, looking at option 2 and why it wasn't as embedded as we maybe hoped it would be by now in relation to the SDS Act being in place for so many years. And that was quite well received. Lots of people gave us lots of really good feedback about it and found it really useful in terms of moving their own thinking and practice on around option 2. And so our conversation then moved on to, well, what about option 3? Around everything that seems to have been done in terms of investment and training and stuff like that in terms of self-directed support is often very focused on options 1 and 2. And option 3 kind of felt like it had been left behind a little bit. So was that just what we thought, or was that actually true? We thought we'll go out there and look for some good practice. Let's find out what people are doing around option 3 that's been really, really successful in terms of changing it. So we went out and worked with people. Probably next slide, Pauline, if that's okay. So we went out and worked with people and definitely wanted to find out what they were doing differently. So if we look at the Self-Directed Support Act guidance, the guidance to the Act, it talks about option 3, and it does say that option 3 needs to be different. And I know from my experience of working with health and social care partnerships, councils, local authorities, often a lot of the focus around self-directed support has not been in option 3 services. It's been around option 1 and option 2, and facilitating people having more choice and control in terms of whether they manage their own budget or whether a third party manages their budget for them, and less investment around what's continuing to be held in-house by the local authority. But the guidance is very clear. It does say that under option 3, the principles of choice and control, collaboration and involvement should continue to apply. And it goes on to say that through changes in practice, commissioning and procurement, local authorities should ensure that services that are provided are as flexible as possible, sufficiently personalised and ready to adapt to the desires of the individuals who use them. Now, that probably isn't a good description of how in-house or perhaps block contracted services used to be. And I think what we were hoping is that what we would find is that it had changed, that people's in-house or block contracted services, their option 3 services that were being directly commissioned on behalf of folk by the authority, would be looking different today to how they looked prior to the Self-Directed Support Act. And that's what we kind of set out to find out. What was the difference? Anecdotally, talking to people through our networks and through various pieces of work that we do, what we tended to hear was option 3 being talked about as traditional services, or sometimes business as usual. So kind of that's just the same. We haven't really done much around option 3. All of our efforts gone into the other 2. So we were hoping to disprove that kind of anecdotal theory by looking for some really good examples of where people had invested the time and thinking to move option 3 services on as well for people. Should we click on? So the people that we worked with, as usual with these things, we contacted as many people as we could think of through all of our contacts and networks and put stuff out on the website, who wants to play. And these were the people that came forward. Aberdeen City, Aberdeen Shire, you can read the list there for yourself. And we also had a guest appearance from south of the border. So Leeds obviously don't deliver option 3 services because they don't have a Self-Directed Support Act in Scotland, but they do have block contracted kind of in-house type services, and they've made some fairly major changes to those, which we'd heard about through other networks. So that proved to be quite an interesting and useful conversation to have with Leeds about the different work that they've done, which I'll talk about a bit more later on. It should be said that of the people on the list, all the health and social care partnerships and authorities that chose to work with us, some have some really, really good practice examples, and you'll find if you dig into the report that there are some kind of case studies, vignettes on some of those where people have really made a real difference, a real investment in their option 3 services. The key ones that are in the report that are highlighted are Aberdeen City, Aberdeen Shire and Fife. And there's also a wee vignette about Leeds, because Leeds is obviously not quite what we're talking about, but it is very similar in terms of what it's doing differently. And obviously we've talked through the whole of people's option 3 approach with each of those sites. We worked through 9 questions with each site. And basically the rest of the presentation is going to be me kind of explaining what those questions were and talking a little bit about what we found in relation to each of those questions. The questions shaped the kind of project really. So if we click through, Pauline. Thank you. So the first question that we asked was, what was the local definition of option 3? And how does this compare to the nationally recognised definition? So if we look at the Self-Directed Support Act, if we look at the guidance, and if we look at the kind of major websites that people would likely to go to find information out about self-directed support and health and social care, the definitions are very clear around option 3. And what we wondered was, how do people in each of the authorities that we're working with define it? Do they define it in the same way, or do they define it somewhat differently? And what we found, you'd be unsurprised to hear, is that people haven't just lifted the very clear definition from the Act or the guidance and plopped it onto their website. They've made it slightly different according to their own local area. And what's really interesting about that is that words, I mean, language is really powerful. And so when we find people using terms such as the authority will commission on your behalf, as opposed to you can choose to allow the authority to commission on your behalf, actually, that's a very different message. I can choose to allow you to, or you will do it, are actually very different messages for people. So the semantics matter. And the definitions were quite different across the different authorities that we spoke to. And given that that's where people begin their journey and their kind of expectations begin to emerge from that very starting point, I think it's really important that we recognise that if the definition is different to what the Scottish Government thinks we're doing in relation to option 3, then we can very quickly go off at a tangent in terms of what we end up doing in practice with people. The other thing I would say about the first question in terms of definitions is it's often quite hard to find on people's websites. So given what we know, that the legislation around self-directed support was intended to make self-directed support the main vehicle for delivery of all social care to all people across Scotland, it's odd that you have to go searching on a lot of local authority websites for self-directed support. It's kind of buried, or it's separate. It may not be buried, it may be very obvious, but it's separate to everything else. So you go into the health and social care tab on the website, and then you have to click through to self-directed support, as though it's something different to receiving health and social care. And often it's in a list that includes things like home care services, residential services, daytime support, self-directed support is another one on the list, and yet all of the above should be being delivered via self-directed support. So it's quite an interesting, that in itself was quite an interesting exploration of how we're defining not just option 3, but how we're defining self-directed support as, in a lot of cases, still something slightly different to what we do all day. And actually it's supposed to be what we do all day. So it's quite an interesting, that was an interesting kind of exploration really. The next thing we asked, which we thought would be quite easy for people to answer, but proved not to be, was what percentage of people are accessing option 3 as defined locally. So what we thought we would probably discover from that is that the majority of people are accessing most of their care and support through option 3. Unless people have put a big investment in a particular service area or a particular geographical area to kind of boost options 1 and 2. And anecdotally, that's what we found. So where sites, so for example, in Aberdeenshire, a lot of investment has gone into the learning disability services. So we see a huge increase in options 1 and 2 in that particular client group. In Fife, a lot of investment's gone into option 3 around care at home services, particularly not exclusively, but particularly for older people. So we find a lot of, option 2 and option 1 increasing in that area. But by and large, unless there's been a real investment in other options, the majority of people are still receiving their care and support through option 3. And given that we are beginning to realise that option 3 hasn't changed very much, that would tend to suggest that most people's experience of receiving care and support across Scotland under self-directed support hasn't changed very much. with kind of small pockets of exceptions across the country. But what was really interesting about that question was that most of the authorities that we worked with couldn't tell us. Either the data isn't collected or the data wasn't readily available when we asked for it. So what we were looking to discover was how many people overall in receipt of social care through that particular area received it under option 3, and then a kind of breakdown by client group so that we could begin to understand, is option 3 predominantly still being used for older people? Is it predominantly being used for people with mental health issues? Or what's that kind of breakdown? We did get statistics from a couple of the participating areas, but because it wasn't everybody, we felt we couldn't include those statistics in the report. So what you'll find in the report is some narrative about what we discovered, which is that by and large, most people are still receiving their care and support via option 3, unless there has been particular investment in a pilot project or a particular scheme of doing things differently, which would boost options 1 and 2, but that tends to be for a discrete client group or in a discrete geographical area within that local authority overall. And it hasn't kind of grown out with that, those pilots and trials. So those were kind of the technical questions, I suppose, if you like. And then we moved on to get into some more of the nitty gritty. So the next question was, how are option 3 services commissioned? So, for example, is it part of a framework? Are they block contracted? Is there still in-house provision? And again, there was quite a variety of responses to that question. And what we discovered was there's been some really interesting work done around option 3 services, around commissioned services in some areas. So one of the examples that's highlighted is the Granite Care Consortium in Aberdeen City, where local providers were invited to come in to have a conversation with contracts and commissioning about, the current way of working wasn't working for people. So people were continually saying, my care and support isn't consistent enough, the people don't turn up on time, or they don't turn up at all of the kinds of concerns about care at home that we're all very, very well rehearsed in. And Aberdeen City took a very proactive approach to that, working with providers to say, OK, come on, together, what can we do about this? The providers themselves came up with the idea of a consortium, working together as a consortium. And again, you can read about this in the report. What came out of that was that the Granite Care Consortium is now a separate body, and all the providers that work to that consortium work together collaboratively to deliver the care and support that is working for people much better because of that. What people are finding is where the incidence of providers literally handing back contracts, which is something that we've seen increasingly over recent years, has stopped, because basically when an individual provider is finding themselves struggling to staff a particular client or a particular group of clients in a particular area, they're simply reaching out back through the consortium to other providers, and other providers are stepping in and picking up that work for people. So there's that collaborative approach to delivery of care and support. The other thing that's happened in that area in particular is providers combining runs, and what we often see in areas where this model doesn't happen is you might have in a given street or in a given village or in a given location within a city, you might have half a dozen different providers all operating in the same area, which doesn't feel particularly efficient or effective. What Granite Care Consortium have been able to do is actually share those runs more meaningfully. So if one provider is already operating in the street that a new referral comes in for, then it makes sense for that provider to pick that work up if possible. So that's been really interesting. One of the other things that we discovered through asking this question is where authorities have stuck with a kind of framework approach. So we use people that are on our framework. The frameworks can be quite restrictive in terms of what people are offered and able to do. And indeed, I spoke to a number of providers through this piece of work and also when we did the option 2 work last year, who said that they would prefer not to work on an option 3 because it restricts their ability to be flexible and person-centred with the people that they support. We have seen some changes in that. So some areas that we worked with are working with the Improvement Hub and the CCPS, the models for kind of outcomes-based commissioning, taking a different approach to commissioning and procurement, and that is working. That is showing some difference. But by and large, what we were finding was that option 3 services were being commissioned very similarly to how they have been up to and including today, really. There is some movement around things like when specs are being written, specifications are being written for new services to be tendered. People tend to be involved, people themselves tend to be getting involved a bit more often in that, which is a good thing, but not necessarily across the board. That's, again, just in pockets that we've discovered. And in some areas there is also still quite a significant in-house provision, and one of the things that we heard from people, I think with one exception, was that where the provision is in-house, it remains quite inflexible and difficult to be kind of person-centred. In that option 3 services, obviously a huge volume of what would fall under that banner is older people's care and support at home. There's also things like day services for older people and for people with learning disabilities in particular, supported living services for people with additional support needs, those kinds of things. And what we did find was that, as we often find in anything to do with self-directed support, the bulk of the work that remains to be done is with older people in those kind of high volume, high turnover services, as opposed to, for example, a day service for people with learning difficulties, for perhaps, for example, where more work has been able to go in because the client group is much more stable and people work with those same clients for a number of years. So it's easier to make those care and support services a little bit more person-centred, I guess, is what you would say. Should we click through? So the next question we asked was, how does people's market facilitation lead to more creative, flexible and person-centred care and support being provided via option 3 locally? And again, what we discovered was market facilitation was being applied to kind of option 2 services and option 1 services reasonably well in a lot of areas, but not so much with option 3, again with those few exceptions to the rule, where people have really kind of invested in doing something differently. So the example that I've just given of Granite Care Consortium is one that was quite different. Another one that people might be familiar with is in Fife. They've got a similar kind of approach where they've got a consortia model, or it's called a collaboration, I think. They've called theirs collaboration rather than a consortium. But those kind of market facilitation pieces of work have led to people being able to be more creative and more flexible. What we discovered is people saying where we are still bound by a kind of traditional contractual process, what they find is that they are still quite bound to time and task kind of working. So there was a huge conversation in every area that I spoke with people through the course of this piece of work about how the whole process, the system and the process that we use to deliver care and support almost runs counter to the values and the kind of aspirations of self-directed support. So we have social workers, commissioning or workers, provider agencies, third sector organisations, all of whom absolutely want to be flexible, person-centred, creative, responsive and deliver these kind of really outcomes-focused services. However, what I repeatedly heard was social workers and social care practitioners talking about having to create an assessment, which is effectively a funding application, which then goes to a panel of some sort to be agreed. And what the panel is looking for is tasks to be delivered and blocks of time to be accounted for, to be allocated. What then happens is that when we ask providers to invoice, they have to invoice on an hourly basis. They have to break up the work that they do for us into units of time, and they have to explain what they did in those units of time by talking about tasks. So much as we would like to focus on outcomes, and we all talk a lot about outcomes, actually when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of how am I going to get paid, I need to actually translate those outcomes into some fairly traditional sounding tasks and break them into units of time in order for the process to actually work. So in terms of market facilitation, there's lots of discussion about culture and practice to try and create a more kind of flexible marketplace. But when those people that are delivering things through that marketplace then come into the system as providers, what they find is they're very quickly kind of squeezed into a more kind of what we might call traditional way of working. We asked the question, this actually comes directly from the framework of standards, has there been funding, support and time for a process of disinvestment in order to reinvest in personalised supports? And I guess people will be unsurprised to hear that the answer to that is overwhelmingly yes, we've tried, but actually business as usual kind of gets in the way. And again, one of the examples that was given as a reason why people have struggled with this in particular was those high volume, high turnover type services. So I spoke to many practitioners who talked about we would love to have the headspace to think with this latest client that I'm sitting in the living room of. I'd love to have the headspace and the time to think about outcomes, creative solutions, to look at the community, to look at the individual's natural supports, to really just use their social care budget to complement and shore up all of those other things that are out there. But actually, I've got 3 other people I need to see today. I've got 10 other people on my waiting list to do an assessment this week. I've got crises coming in, and I haven't got the time. So what we've found is a lot of that where there has been funding and time allocated, it's often not the people at the front line that are spending that time. So the funding and time that's allocated to think about how we can do business differently is kind of people working over there to the side while the front line get on with doing the job, the day job. And somehow that's something that we've been repeating, I think, for 10 or 15 years now in relation to self-directed support. And it clearly isn't actually having the impact that we think it needs to have. The question about disinvestment, there was a really interesting conversation in at least one, if not 2 authorities that we worked in around day services, particularly day services for people with learning disabilities, where the time has gone in to think about more person-centred and outcomes-focused support plans with individuals, and investment has been made in alternative services that are getting those people that have the ability and the kind of aspiration to do something different out of those day services into the community, to different activities, perhaps into voluntary work, perhaps even into paid work, which has been extremely successful for those individual people. However, what hasn't happened is a reduction in the cost of the day centre that they're now not using. So it's almost counterproductive, because that day centre is then costing the authority the same amount as it was before, but actually delivering a service to less people. And then the new services have to be funded elsewhere by through a different process. What's interesting about that is often the new delivery for people that come away from the day service is put through an option 1 or an option 2, and the day service that remains an option 3. So again, it begs the question, why aren't we investing the time in the option 3 service to enable that to be different, to enable the option 3 service as it stands to be the place where people are then able to move on from using that resource? But it's all still very tangled up, I think, in terms of funding. This was an interesting question. Are people told the likely level of budget available irrespective of the option that they choose? I'd like to just say no to that, because it's probably honest. Because I think what we've discovered is that with a very small number of exceptions, people are told the likely level of budget if they're taking a direct payment under option 1, and people are usually told the likely level of budget if they're taking an option 2. But pretty much nobody knows what the budget is if they're taking option 3. So the standards require that people are told what their budget is regardless of which option they choose. What we heard repeatedly from people was, well, it's just us paying for it, so it doesn't really matter, or it's part of a block contract, or it's an in-house service, or it's option 3, so it's traditional services, it's business as usual, it's us that's paying for it. You know, the person isn't given that information. So I think that's a really, really interesting point, and actually quite a flaw in what we're doing, how we're working with people, that it's a fundamental expectation of the SDS Act that people will be told that likely level of budget regardless of which option they choose, and actually that doesn't seem to be happening in practice. If people are seen to be being assessed into option 3 services, for want of a better way of putting it, budget just isn't really discussed with them, which is and that's pretty much across the board. So then the last 3 questions, if we want to flick forward, what changes have been made to option 3 services to ensure that they aspire to match options 1 and 2 in terms of choice and control for people who choose to let the authority commission on their behalf? Some really good stuff here in terms of how people's actual day-to-day care and support is delivered. So we heard lots of good examples from option 3 services where a lot of time has been spent with the staff that deliver that care and support, working on more person-centred care and support plans, more person-centred approaches to delivery, whether that's actually in a residential setting or in a daytime support setting, or even with people being supported in their own homes through kind of home care or visiting support. And again, what's really interesting about that is that's very much about practice. And often what I heard from people was the practice is not what's expected by the kind of formal care and support plan from the authority, the one that got the money, the one that went through panel. So the one that went through panel is a time and task kind of focused care and support plan in some cases. But when we actually get our hands on the person as a provider and we start working with them, we do our level best to be flexible and creative and person-centred. People then talked about all the restrictions that you would expect to hear about, lack of staffing, lack of funding, lack of time, overwhelmed, people being overwhelmed with demands and all this kind of stuff. But there clearly is an aspiration on behalf of everybody, I think, who works within health and social care to deliver choice and control to people, in terms of when I'm actually working with somebody as a staff member, whether that's a practitioner in social work or a provider agency. But it would seem that the system itself is not helping that, is kind of hindering that in many ways, as we've discussed already. And in terms of a variety of examples of things being purchased, pretty much things being purchased under option 3 are what you would expect to be being purchased under option 3. So it's care at home, residential and supported living type services, day type services. There are a few exceptions to that where people have been able to use their option 3 support to do things slightly more creatively. But by and large, the answer to that question is if people want to do things, use services that are non-regulated, for example, like maybe a gardening project or a social care, a social support type project, type service, or if they want to go to local gyms or things like this, then they have to have an option 1 or an option 2. The flexibility just isn't there for those things to be available when the authority commissions on my behalf. And again, I think we can all recognise that isn't the aspiration of the Act. The aspiration of the Act is that I should be able to get my outcomes met in whichever way I makes sense to me in my life, regardless of which mechanism I choose to use to manage the budget. So we talked about, with most people, what's had to change, and what we ended up having were conversations about what still needs to change. So what had to change where there was success, and certainly when you read through the report, and I hope that you will take the time to read through the report, what you'll find is where people have invested time and money into a pilot project or a test of change, things have really changed for that small group of people in that particular pilot project or that particular test of change, which might be a whole client group in some areas, or it might be a particular service delivery function, or it might just be a particular locality within the overall area. So where that's been successful, where tests of change and pilots and new ways of working have been have taken hold, what's needed in terms of that change is a real collaborative approach, is good leadership, people being committed to working through problems and finding solutions together, and everybody being on board across the whole of the organisation. We heard a lot about various different blocks in the organisation. A lot of those blocks you'll be unsurprised to hear about, and we'll come to when we talk about the recommendations a little bit later on. But what we discovered, and I think is still the major step, is that where change has occurred within Option 3 services, it has occurred in pockets. Those pockets might be small or large, but they're still just pockets, and it hasn't actually rolled out and embedded across the whole authority, even where something's been really successful, say with a particular service delivery or a particular client group. It's yet to then be scaled up and scaled out. So yeah, there's a lot still to do. If we click through, Pauline. And this is my kind of favourite quote from the entire piece of work that I did with people. Sadly, I heard it from more than one person, and the people that mainly made this kind of comment were social care practitioners, social workers, care managers. You're like a hamster on a wheel. You are constantly in motion, but you're going nowhere. And this speaks directly to that kind of high volume, high turnover, lack of staff, those kind of restrictions that people feel they're under pressure so much. And this is true of all services, but it felt particularly pertinent when talking about Option 3. People talked about Option 3 being the default service. People talked about it being the crisis response service. People talked about it being the quick solution to problems, and very much the go-to solution for hospital discharge for people. So when you think about all of those four things, that's the bulk of the work that comes through the social work door. And if people are recognising that I'm just a hamster on a wheel because it keeps coming and it keeps coming and it keeps coming, I'm just going to keep putting people in Option 3. And people's aspiration was, we will then move on. We'll bang them into an Option 3 service to get the crisis over, get them out of hospital, deal with the emergency, and then we'll go back in a couple of weeks. We'll do a really quick review. We'll take our time. We'll create a more outcomes focused, person-centered support plan. We'll talk about other options, or we'll talk about how that Option 3 service could be a better fit for them to meet their outcomes. But that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because the workers don't have time to go back, because the system doesn't expect them to go back until perhaps maybe 6 weeks or 6 months later. And by the time they go back, the individual has got settled into that service that was provided as a sticking plaster and doesn't want to change. So that hamster on the wheel it really stuck with me as probably one of the biggest blocks to why we haven't seen more progress in Option 3. And it doesn't look like a potato. It definitely looks like a hamster to me. Thank you, Pauline. So let's click through. We'll talk about the recommendations, and then we can take some questions. I've not been looking at the chat, but I'm assuming Pauline and Danielle have, so can kind of facilitate that. So our recommendations, make it clear that SDS is business as usual. I'm kind of really surprised and slightly saddened that we even have to say that now, after 13 years of the Act being in place. But self-directed support is the mechanism through which we should be delivering all care and support. It shouldn't be a separate thing on the website. It shouldn't be something people apply for or choose. We shouldn't really be talking about self-directed support as a separate thing. It's how we do that. That's a massive recommendation, and it requires an awful lot of I think awareness raising, I think training, I think education for people, and some real kind of systemic examination of what is it that we do that drives us to see SDS as still somehow separate. This was a really big one as well. Invest in real time at all levels across the sector and breaking out of silos. So one of the things that has been recognised as being really successful, particularly in remote and rural communities, in terms of being able to deliver care and support to people, is when we are allowing or enabling providers to provide services out with what they would traditionally be registered to provide. So what I mean by that is if I'm a provider who delivers personal care support to older people in a particular location, and somebody with a learning disability requires personal care support, I can't do that under my registration because I'm only registered to work with older people. Or I might be a provider who's registered to work with people with mental health issues to give them housing support or social support, but I can't work with people with dementia because I haven't got that box ticked on my registration. So there's a whole conversation there, and there are some really interesting projects and pieces of work where people have started to break some of that down. Leeds is a really good example, which is why we included it, of where all of that's kind of been taken away and the providers simply provide what it is that people need within their patch. So they've got a patch-based model of home and outreach support, and it's from 18 to no upper age limit. Whatever the person requires is delivered by the providers in that area. And that seems to be one of the big things that's holding us back, is particularly in remote and rural areas, but not exclusively, when providers are only able to provide care to a particular client group or a particular type of care, then that restricts us and our ability to be more flexible in terms of our option 3 services. Free personal care came up a lot, so we need to reframe our thinking around free personal care. Free personal care is a wonderful thing. It's a great gift of the Scottish Government, and I think everybody would agree that it's a great thing that we've got in Scotland, and obviously our colleagues from south of the border look on it quite enviously a lot of the time. However, one of the unintended consequences of free personal care is that everything else pales into insignificance next to it. And what we have is a situation where the predominant thinking is around the personal care aspect, and often we get that box ticked without really thinking about the importance of the relationship that the individual has with the person delivering that free personal care, or the relationship that free personal care has to the rest of the person's life. What's the point of being washed and dressed and having had my breakfast if I'm then going to sit lonely and miserable in my house all day? Or if it's going to be a different person that comes and gets me washed and dressed every day, and I'm just going to feel really disconnected from that process. So how we do that, I think it's really important that we start really considering. Letting go of the hourly rate unit of care. We've been talking about this for years, and outcomes-based commissioning is trying to kind of direct us in this direction, but we're wedded to it. Contracts and the way that we deliver, the way that we pay people is still very much wedded to an hourly unit, and with very few exceptions, we've not been able to break out of that at all. We've not seen examples where people have broken out of that. So what people have done is flipped it around. So we pay you in advance for the amount of work that you do, and then you decide how to use those hours under your option 3 contract, and then you let us know whether you've used too many or too few, but it's still based on that hourly unit. So rather than the kind of outcomes that are being delivered to people. Another recommendation, number 5, is about revising eligibility criteria. That we all know, and again, this is a well-rehearsed conversation. If we don't let people through the door until they're in crisis, then we're only ever going to be on that hamster wheel fighting crises and putting in crisis intervention services. We need to be working with people much earlier in their journey and helping them and supporting them before they get to the point where they're in that desperate stage of their life. There was a real thing about untangling procurement myths from the truth. So I was told with absolute categorical certainty by procurement and contracts colleagues in one area that A was absolutely impossible, and in another area that A was absolutely possible. And they're all working to the same law. So I don't think for a minute any of them believe that they're doing anything wrong. I think they all think they're delivering that what's required of them. But there obviously is some interpretation going on somewhere. And what that leads to is a lot of myths around, well, you can't do this or you can't do that. You can't use an option 3 service to go to the gym, or you can't use an option 3 service to buy an option 3 budget to buy a piece of equipment, or to do something that isn't a registered service. There's a lot of mythology around it, and we need to untangle some of that. And then the final recommendation is collecting better data to inform market facilitation. So one of the things that I heard when I asked people how many percentage of people are using option 3, and again, this came up in the option 2 piece of work, what I was often told is, oh, it's the majority of people, but they don't necessarily choose it. So they're in option 3 because that's what the service was that was available. And we heard this in option 2. They're in option 2 often because that's the only service that's available. So that's not really good data. If what we're collecting is the numbers of people using that option, but not whether they chose to use it or not, then that's not really good data to help us facilitate a different marketplace. So those are our recommendations. I think that's probably the last slide, is it? Oh, yes. Oh, well done. Well done. I asked Pauline if she could put this on because I nicked it off the internet because I absolutely love this book. For those of you that haven't seen it, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. It's absolutely wonderful. And there's a little quote there. "We've a long way to go," sighed the boy. "Yes, but look how far we've come," said the horse. And I think that's probably what I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes at least, if not slightly longer. Probably all sounds a little bit depressing. Oh my God, we've still got so far to go. We've still got such a long way to go. But if we look back, we have come a long way. And if we look at some of those examples that are highlighted in the report and all the areas that have been working with us in the report, people have made progress in option 3, and there is stuff that can be emulated, scaled up and built upon. We just need to put the time and investment in to do it.